The evening air had a crisp edge to it, as streetlights flickered on throughout the tree-lined streets of Oakwood Heights. This part of town wore its wealth openly. Manicured lawns stretched before stately homes, luxury cars gleamed in circular driveways, and an unspoken rule seemed to exist about who belonged and who didn't. Officer Ray Wilson cruised slowly in his patrol car, window rolled down despite the chill. 8 years patrolling these streets had given him a sense of ownership. He knew every regular jogger, every dog walker, every teenager who snuck out after curfew, or at least he knew the ones he thought belonged here. Ray took pride in keeping Oakwood safe. Though his definition of safety had always been selective, he noticed things, specifically people, that looked out of place to him. Tonight was no different as his headlights swept across a black sedan with tinted windows parked along Maple Avenue. The car wasn't breaking any laws. It was legally parked, no expired tags, no visible violations. But to Ray, it didn't fit. "Dispatch, I need a plate check," he said into his radio, reading off the license number. His fingers drummed impatiently on the steering wheel as he waited. "Unit 347. That vehicle is registered to David Patel. No flags, no violations." The dispatcher's voice crackled back. The name meant nothing to Ray. He pulled behind the sedan and flipped on his light bar. Protocol suggested he should move on. There was no violation to investigate. But Ray had developed his own way of policing over the years, one that the department had never quite managed to correct. Inside the black sedan, David Patel was wrapping up an important phone call. As the newly appointed City Commissioner of Public Safety, his days stretched long, often bleeding into evenings like this one. He'd pulled over to finish reviewing budget proposals while speaking with the mayor about tomorrow's council meeting. "I'll have those numbers for you first thing tomorrow," David said, organizing papers on his passenger seat. "The allocation for community policing looks promising, but we'll need to." The harsh tap on his window cut his words short. Blue and red lights reflected off his rearview mirror, sending a familiar tension through his body. David had experienced this before, many times despite his prestigious education and professional success. He carefully put down his phone, making sure the call had ended, and placed both hands visible on the steering wheel, a habit born from necessity rather than choice. Officer Wilson stood outside, flashlight beam aimed directly at David's face, temporarily blinding him. David lowered his window halfway. "License and registration," Ray demanded without greeting or explanation. "May I ask what seems to be the problem, officer?" David asked calmly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through him. Ray's flashlight didn't waver. "License and registration now." David nodded slowly. "I'm going to reach for my wallet in my back pocket, okay?" He narrated his movements carefully, another learned behavior. "And then I'll get the registration from the glove compartment." The flashlight followed his every movement. David handed over his license, the one that identified him not just as David Patel, but as Commissioner David Patel, the very person overseeing police operations throughout the city. His suit jacket lay folded in the back seat. Tonight he wore a simple sweater and jeans, looking nothing like the formal photos that occasionally appeared in the local newspaper. Ray studied the ID with obvious skepticism. "This says you're the Public Safety Commissioner." "That's correct." Ray's laugh held no humor. "Right, and I'm the police chief." "What are you really doing in this neighborhood?" David maintained his composure. "I was on my way home from the office and pulled over to take an important call about tomorrow's budget meeting. I can show you my city credentials if that would help." "Step out of the vehicle." "Sir?" Ray's hand had already moved to rest on his holster, a subtle threat that spoke volumes. "Officer, I'm not sure that's necessary. I'm simply—" "I said step out of the vehicle now." David took a deep breath. He knew the dance all too well. The delicate balance between asserting his rights and avoiding escalation. Years of similar encounters had taught him that dignity sometimes required strategic compliance. He carefully opened his door and stepped out, standing to his full height. Ray towered over him by several inches, using his size to intimidate. "Hands against the car, spread your feet." "Officer Wilson," David said, reading the nameplate. "I understand you're doing your job, but this seems excessive for someone who was simply parked legally and taking a phone call." Something flickered across Ray's face. Surprise that David had noted his name, perhaps, or irritation at being questioned. "You don't seem to understand how this works. When I give an order, you follow it." This is a high-value neighborhood. We get reports of suspicious activity. And what exactly is suspicious about sitting in my car? Ray's jaw tightened. People like you don't typically have business in Oakwood Heights unless you're working in someone's house. The words hung in the air between them. David felt a familiar heaviness settle in his chest, the weight of assumptions, of prejudice barely concealed behind a badge. I see, David said quietly. And what exactly do you mean by people like me? Ray didn't answer directly. Instead, he gestured again toward the car. Hands on the vehicle. I need to check if you're who you say you are. David complied, placing his palms against the cool metal of his car roof. The indignity burned, but he remained outwardly calm as Ray patted him down with unnecessary thoroughness. My phone is on the driver's seat, David said. If you'll allow me to make a call, my assistant can verify my identity. So now you've got an assistant? Ray's tone dripped with disbelief. Let me guess, you've also got a corner office at City Hall? As a matter of fact, I do, David replied evenly. A couple walking their dog on the opposite sidewalk slowed to watch the scene unfolding. David noticed their concerned glances, the woman pulling out her phone. In another time, he might have been grateful for witnesses. Tonight, the public spectacle only deepened his humiliation. Ray noticed them too. Move along, folks. Police business, David spoke quietly. Officer Wilson, I understand you're being cautious, but this situation could be resolved quickly with a simple verification call. The mayor is expecting me at a meeting tomorrow morning where I'll be presenting the police department's budget proposals. Sure you are, Ray scoffed. But something uncertain flickered across his face. He held David's ID card, turning it over in his hands. Stay right here. Ray returned to his patrol car, presumably to run a more thorough check. David remained standing beside his vehicle, acutely aware of how the scene appeared. Another man of color being detained in a wealthy neighborhood where he supposedly didn't belong. His phone began ringing from inside the car. Probably his assistant wondering why their call had dropped so abruptly. David looked toward Ray, silently seeking permission to answer it. Ray emerged from his patrol car, his expression harder now. That ID might look real, but anyone can get fake credentials these days. I find it hard to believe the city's public safety commissioner would be sitting alone in a car on a side street at night. I pulled over to take a call rather than driving distracted, David explained again. Something I believe your department actively encourages. Let's continue this conversation down at the station, Ray decided, reaching for his handcuffs. Turn around. This is completely unnecessary, David protested, his patience finally beginning to fray. Call your sergeant. Call the station. One simple verification call will clear this up. But Ray had committed to his course of action, his pride now tangled with his suspicion. Last warning. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. David closed his eyes briefly, calculating his options. Physical resistance would only escalate the situation. Continued verbal protest seemed equally futile. With practiced dignity, he turned and placed his hands behind his back, feeling the cold metal of handcuffs close around his wrists. As Ray led him toward the patrol car, David noticed more neighbors watching from porches and windows. The irony wasn't lost on him. Tomorrow he was scheduled to review policies on community policing and racial bias in law enforcement. Tonight he was experiencing exactly why those reforms were so desperately needed. Watch your head, Ray said mechanically as he guided David into the back seat of the patrol car. As the door closed beside him, David caught a glimpse of his phone still on the driver's seat of his sedan, screen lit up with incoming calls. He wondered how long it would take for people to realize where he was, and who exactly Ray Wilson had just placed under arrest. The patrol car pulled away from the curb, blue lights spinning silently in the gathering darkness. In the front seat, Officer Wilson radioed dispatch reporting that he was bringing in a suspect for questioning. Behind him, David sat quietly, already thinking about what would happen next, not just tonight but in the days and weeks to come. This officer had made a mistake that would have consequences far beyond what either of them could imagine. The patrol car moved through the quiet streets of Oakwood Heights, leaving behind David's sedan with his phone still glowing on the seat. In the back of the police car, David sat straight back despite the handcuffs. The plastic seat was uncomfortable, designed that way on purpose. Through the mesh divider, he could see the back of Officer Wilson's head, rigid with unearned confidence. You're making a serious mistake, David said calmly. Ray glanced in the rearview mirror. Everyone says that. I imagine they do, David replied. But in this case, it happens to be true. The radio crackled with dispatcher chatter. David listened carefully, years of working with the department having taught him the codes and shorthand. He noted that Ray hadn't called in that he was bringing someone to the station, an oversight that went against standard protocol. Officer Wilson, may I ask why you haven't radioed in that you're transporting a detainee? Ray's eyes narrowed in the mirror. You seem to know a lot about police procedure for someone who was just taking a call in a nice neighborhood. As I've told you several times, I'm the City Commissioner of Public Safety. Police procedures fall directly under my oversight. Ray's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. Look, I don't know what game you're playing, but fake government IDs are a serious offense. Add that to trespassing and resisting. Resisting? David's voice remained level, but disbelief crept in. I complied with every instruction you gave me. And as for trespassing, I was parked legally on a public street. You refused to answer questions about your presence in the neighborhood. I answered every question truthfully. You simply chose not to believe me. Ray made a sharp turn, deliberately jostling David in the back seat. Keep talking. The more charges I can add, the better. David fell silent, recognizing the futility of the exchange. He'd seen this behavior before, an officer digging in deeper rather than acknowledging an error. His mind raced ahead to what would happen at the station. Someone would recognize him there. The question was how much damage would be done before that happened. They pulled into the station parking lot, the building squat and institutional under fluorescent lights. Ray came around and opened the door, gripping David's arm firmly as he led him inside. The grip was unnecessarily tight, a small power play that David noted mentally. The front desk area was busy despite the hour. 2 officers were processing paperwork, while a young man in handcuffs sat on a bench looking defeated. A phone rang unanswered. The scene was familiar to David. He'd toured every precinct in the city after his appointment, though he'd always entered through the front door, not the side entrance reserved for detainees. Desk Sergeant Ana Cortez looked up as they entered, her experienced eyes taking in the scene, Ray's proud stance and David's handcuffed wrists. Then her gaze traveled to David's face and something changed in her expression. Commissioner Patel? Her voice cut through the ambient noise of the station. Ray's grip on David's arm slackened just slightly. Hello, Sergeant Cortez, David replied, his voice steady. It seems there's been a misunderstanding. Ana came around from behind the desk, confusion clear on her face. Officer Wilson, why is the commissioner in handcuffs? The room didn't exactly fall silent, but a noticeable hush spread as heads turned toward them. Ray's face flushed, a deep crimson that crept up from his collar. This man claims to be Commissioner Patel, Ray said, but his voice had lost its earlier certainty. He was acting suspiciously in Oakwood Heights. Acting suspiciously? David repeated. I was parked legally, taking a phone call. Ana reached for her keys. Let me remove those cuffs, sir. Ray stepped back, his hand still on David's arm. Hold on. We need to verify his identity first. Officer Wilson, Ana said, her tone professional but firm. I've met with Commissioner Patel monthly for the past 6 months during command staff meetings. This is definitely him. Other officers had begun to gather, drawn by the unusual scene. David recognized a few faces from budget hearings and training seminars. The weight of collective recognition hung in the air, and Ray's position grew more untenable by the second. It's department policy to verify identity, Ray insisted, but his voice had become defensive. Then verify it, David said quietly. Call Chief Thomas. Call the mayor. Call my assistant, who's probably wondering why I suddenly disappeared from our call. Ana had already pulled out her phone. I'm calling Captain Lee right now. Ray finally released David's arm, taking a small step back. His face was a complex mix of emotions, embarrassment battling with anger, pride wrestling with the dawning reality of his mistake. A younger officer approached cautiously. Sir, I attended your presentation last month on community policing initiatives. It's an honor to meet you, though I wish it were under different circumstances. David nodded acknowledgement, feeling the room's dynamics shift around him. Thank you, Officer. Alvarez, sir. Miguel Alvarez. Thank you, Officer Alvarez. I'd shake your hand, but... David turned slightly to show his still cuffed wrists. Ana returned, keys in hand. Captain Lee is on her way down. She said to remove the handcuffs immediately. As the cuffs came off, David rubbed his wrists, aware of the eyes on him. He could have exploded in justified anger. He could have threatened jobs and careers. Many would have, given his position. Instead, he maintained the same calm demeanor he'd shown throughout the ordeal. "Is there somewhere private where I can make a phone call?" he asked Anna. "My assistant is likely concerned, and I left my phone in my vehicle." "Of course, Commissioner. You can use the captain's office." Ray stood awkwardly to the side, looking like he wanted to disappear. Instead of acknowledging David directly, he turned to Anna. "I was just following protocol. The ID looked suspicious, and he was in a high-alert neighborhood." Before Anna could respond, the station doors burst open. Captain Grace Lee entered, still adjusting her jacket as if she'd thrown it on hastily. Her expression shifted from concern to shock as she spotted David. "Commissioner Patel, I just got the call. I can't believe it," she glared at Ray. "Officer Wilson, my office now." "Captain," David interjected, "before we go further, I'd like to make that phone call. And I'll need someone to retrieve my vehicle and belongings." Grace nodded quickly. "Of course, sir. Officer Alvarez, please escort the commissioner to my office. And Officer Chen, take a patrol car to retrieve the commissioner's vehicle from Oakwood Heights." As David followed Alvarez down the hallway, he heard Grace hiss to Ray, "What were you thinking?" The captain's office was neat and professional, with commendations on the walls and a photo of Grace shaking hands with the mayor at her promotion ceremony. David was in that photo too, just out of frame. He sat in the visitor's chair while Officer Alvarez hovered awkwardly by the door. "You can leave me, Officer Alvarez. I'm fine." "Sir, about what happened?" Alvarez seemed genuinely troubled. "We're not all like that." David nodded thoughtfully. "I know. That's why what happened tonight matters." Left alone, David used the desk phone to call his assistant, explaining the situation briefly. Then he called the mayor, waking her from sleep to give her a heads up before the story inevitably broke. By the time he finished, voices were raised in the hallway outside the office. Completely unacceptable conduct. Captain Lee's voice carried clearly. "I was doing my job." Ray's response was defensive, brittle with wounded pride. "He fit the profile of what exactly?" Grace's voice dropped dangerously. "Choose your next words very carefully, Officer Wilson." There was a telling silence. David stood and straightened his sweater, composing himself for what came next. The door opened, and Grace entered with Ray trailing behind her, looking both defiant and shaken. "Commissioner Patel, I can't apologize enough for this incident," Grace began. "I assure you that appropriate disciplinary action—" David raised his hand. "Captain Lee, I appreciate your concern. But right now I'd like to hear from Officer Wilson." Ray looked up, surprised. He'd clearly expected to be talked about, not to. "Officer Wilson," David continued, "you detained me without cause, dismissed my identification, placed me in handcuffs, and brought me to the station, all because I was sitting in my car making a phone call. I'd like to understand why." Ray shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, there have been reports of suspicious activity in that neighborhood. I was being thorough." "Suspicious activity," David repeated. "And what made my behavior suspicious? Was it the legal parking? The lack of any violations? Or was it something else entirely?" The question hung in the air, its implication clear to everyone in the room. Ray's jaw tightened. "I was doing my duty to protect the neighborhood." "From what?" David pressed. "From whom?" Before Ray could answer, there was a knock at the door. Officer Chen entered, holding David's phone and briefcase. "Sir, your vehicle has been brought to the station lot, and I retrieved your belongings as requested." David accepted his phone, noting the screen filled with missed calls and messages. "Thank you, Officer Chen." As Chen left, David turned back to Ray. "You know, Officer Wilson, tomorrow I'm presenting budget proposals for next year's police operations. One section focuses specifically on bias training and community relations. I was reviewing those numbers when you knocked on my window." Ray stared at a point just past David's shoulder, saying nothing. David continued, his voice level but firm. "Captain Lee, I'll need a full report of this incident by morning. And I'd like Officer Wilson's body camera footage preserved immediately." Ray's head snapped up. "My camera wasn't activated." "There was no reason to." "That's department policy for all stops," Grace cut in sharply. "My phone was recording audio during the initial contact," David added. "My assistant heard much of what happened before the call disconnected." Something shifted in Ray's expression. The realization that his words, his tone, his conduct were all captured. Evidence that couldn't be explained away or reinterpreted. David checked his watch. It was late, and tomorrow would be a long day of meetings that now carried far more weight than he'd anticipated. Captain Lee, I'll be on my way now. Please expect my office to follow up in the morning. As David left the station, phone in hand and dignity intact despite everything that had happened, he knew this night had changed the trajectory of his work in ways he couldn't yet fully comprehend. The reforms he'd been carefully crafting for months had just become deeply, personally urgent. Behind him, through the station's glass doors, he could see Ray Wilson standing rigid as Captain Lee continued speaking, her gestures sharp with anger. The officer had made a critical mistake tonight, one that would have consequences far beyond a single traffic stop. For the city, for the department, and for David himself, everything had just changed. The night air felt different to David as he walked to his car in the police station parking lot. The same stars hung overhead. The same autumn chill cut through his sweater, but something fundamental had shifted. His hand still held the phantom sensation of handcuffs. His ears still rang with Officer Wilson's dismissive tone. He sat in his sedan for a long moment before starting the engine. His phone buzzed continuously, missed calls, texts, and notifications forming a digital avalanche. His assistant Lisa had apparently set fire to every communication channel after hearing the beginning of his detention through the dropped call. David called her first. "I'm okay," he said when she answered mid-ring. "Thank goodness," Lisa exhaled heavily. "I've been going out of my mind. I heard everything, that officer, the way he spoke to you. It was recorded on my end." "You have a recording?" David hadn't realized the call had captured that much. "Everything until he made you get out of the car. I've already sent it to your email and made 3 backups. The mayor's called twice and the city attorney wants to talk to you immediately." David checked the time, nearly midnight. "Has anyone gone to the press yet?" "Not from our office, but someone at the station must have tipped them off. Channel 4 called asking for comment about an incident involving the commissioner." David sighed. There would be no containing this now. "I'm heading home. Set up a meeting with the mayor and city attorney for 7 a.m. tomorrow." He ended the call and finally started driving, the familiar route giving him time to think. This wasn't just about one officer's mistake anymore. The incident had become a flashpoint, a test of the very reforms he'd been working to implement. His phone rang again. Mayor Sharon Rodriguez this time. "David, are you all right?" Her voice carried genuine concern beneath the political calculation. "I'm fine, Sharon. Heading home now. This is unacceptable, completely unacceptable." Her tone hardened. "Officer Wilson has a history of complaints. 3 excessive force allegations in the past 2 years, all dismissed by internal affairs." This wasn't news to David, who had been reviewing such patterns across the department. "How did you get that information so quickly?" "The police chief called me in a panic after Captain Lee briefed him. He's worried about lawsuits, press coverage, protests. I'm worried about justice." She paused. "And optics, if I'm being honest. This couldn't have happened at a worse time politically. Or a better time for reform," David countered. "My budget proposals go before the council tomorrow. The ones with funding for bias training, community oversight, and accountability measures." Silence hung on the line briefly. "The same proposals the police union has been fighting?" "The very same." "I'll see you at 7, the mayor said, her tone shifting from concern to strategic. "This changes everything." By the time David arrived home, his neighborhood was unusually active for midnight. A news van idled at the corner, and he recognized a reporter from the local station standing near his driveway. Word had spread faster than he'd anticipated. David drove past his house, circling the block to enter through the alley access to his garage. Inside, his wife waited in her bathrobe, face tight with worry. "I saw it on the news," Priya said, embracing him. "A neighbor called to say there were reporters outside." "I'm sorry," David said, holding her close. "It's going to be a circus for a while. Are you really okay?" She pulled back to examine his face, seeing beyond the composed expression he showed the world. Angry, tired, but more determined than ever. He rolled his shoulders, trying to release the tension. "I've spent months pushing paper, making careful arguments for change. Tonight I lived exactly why those changes matter." Priya nodded. She'd heard his stories before. being pulled over without cause, followed in stores, asked to show extra ID at the bank. The difference was now the entire city would be watching. "Your mother called from Mumbai," she said. "The story's already online." David checked his phone again. 47 missed calls, 93 text messages, and over 200 emails. The incident was spreading like wildfire across social media. Someone had captured video of him being led into the police station in handcuffs. The 15-second clip already shared thousands of times. "I need to listen to Lisa's recording," he said. Together, they sat at the kitchen table as David played the audio from his detention. Officer Wilson's voice came through clearly, the demanding tone, the disbelief when David identified himself, and most damning of all, the comment about people like you not belonging in Oakwood Heights. Priya's expression darkened as she listened. "He should be fired." "It's not that simple," David replied, though part of him wished it were. "The union contract, the disciplinary procedures, the burden of proof, the system is designed to protect officers. Even ones like him? Especially ones like him." David rubbed his eyes. "But this recording changes things. There's no ambiguity, no he said, she said. Just clear evidence." His phone rang again. City Attorney Doug Henderson. "I've reviewed the audio recording," Doug said without preamble. Wilson's toast. "You know it's not that straightforward," David cautioned. "It is this time. The stars have aligned. We have audio evidence, multiple witnesses at the station, and your position gives this incident a profile we can leverage." Doug's legal mind was already building a case. The police union will try to shield him, but they can't fight the court of public opinion on this one. "This isn't just about punishing one officer," David insisted. "It's about changing the system that created him. One battle at a time, Commissioner. The mayor wants a press conference tomorrow after your council meeting. She's thinking we go big. Announce Wilson's suspension, launch a department-wide investigation, and fast-track your reform proposals." After finishing the call, David sat in the growing quiet of his kitchen. The clock showed 1:30 a.m. In less than 6 hours, he needed to be showered, dressed, and ready to navigate a political firestorm. "Come to bed," Priya urged. "You need rest." "In a minute," he promised. Left alone, David opened his laptop and pulled up the police department budget proposals he'd been reviewing when Officer Wilson knocked on his window. The pages of careful statistics, cost projections, and reform initiatives now seemed both more vital and more insufficient than ever. He began making notes, revising figures, strengthening language. If this incident had opened a door for real change, he intended to walk through it with purpose. Across town, in a modest apartment on the city's east side, Officer Ray Wilson sat on the edge of his bed, still in uniform. His phone lit up with messages from fellow officers, some offering support, others keeping careful distance. The police union representative had called 3 times with increasingly urgent voicemails. "This will blow over," his girlfriend Terry assured him from the doorway. "You were just doing your job." Ray wasn't so sure. The look on Captain Lee's face, the immediate recognition from other officers, the commissioner's measured response. Everything pointed to consequences beyond anything he'd faced before. "They have a recording," he said hollowly. My body camera was off, but his phone was recording. Terry sat beside him. "What exactly did you say?" Ray tried to remember, but the encounter had become a blur of poor decisions stacked upon one another. Had he actually said anything explicitly racist? Or just implied it with his actions, his tone, his assumptions? In his 8 years on the force, he'd made similar stops dozens of times without consequence. "It doesn't matter," he finally said. "They've been looking for someone to make an example of. Looks like I'm it." The 5 a.m. news played quietly on Terry's nightstand radio. The top story was already about him, though they hadn't released his name yet, just referring to an officer who had detained the city commissioner under questionable circumstances. In the pre-dawn darkness, neither Ray nor David slept much. Both men prepared for a day that would redefine their lives and perhaps their city. Morning brought a frenzy of activity to City Hall. News crews set up before sunrise, jockeying for position near the main entrance. By 6:30 a.m., protesters had begun to gather. A hastily organized but growing crowd carrying signs demanding accountability and reform. David arrived through a side entrance, escorted by 2 anxious aides. The mayor waited in her office with the city attorney, Police Chief Thomas Rivera, and 2 stony-faced city council members. "The recording is damning," Mayor Rodriguez said after greetings were exchanged. "Chief Rivera has placed Officer Wilson on administrative leave pending investigation, effective immediately." Chief Rivera nodded, though his expression revealed his discomfort. "The department apologizes for this incident, Commissioner. It's not representative of our values or training." "With respect, Chief," David replied. "If it wasn't representative, it wouldn't have happened. Officer Wilson felt comfortable making assumptions based on my appearance because our system has allowed such behavior to go unchecked." The room fell silent. "The budget proposal needs revision," David continued, pulling out the folder he'd worked on through the night. "I've increased funding for the Oversight Board and Body Cam program. I've also added a provision requiring psychological evaluations for officers with multiple civilian complaints." The police chief's face tightened. "That's going to face significant pushback from the union. So will Officer Wilson's termination," David acknowledged. "But we now have a compelling case for both." Mayor Rodriguez reviewed the updated figures. "The council meeting starts in 30 minutes. These changes are substantial. So was being handcuffed and detained for sitting in my car," David replied evenly. The mayor nodded slowly. "Let's proceed. This moment won't come again." As they gathered their materials to head to the council chambers, David felt the weight of expectations settling on his shoulders. What had begun as a personal humiliation had transformed overnight into a catalyst for the very changes he'd been fighting to implement. Outside, the crowd of protesters had grown. Their chants echoed through the building's marble halls. They didn't know yet that for once the person at the center of the story was actually in a position to do something about it. David straightened his tie, tucked the budget proposals under his arm, and walked toward the council chambers. Yesterday, he had been just another man profiled by a biased officer. Today, he was the Commissioner of Public Safety with the power to ensure it never happened again. The doors to the chamber opened, cameras flashed, and David stepped forward into the bright lights, ready to transform a personal injustice into systemic change. The city council chambers hummed with unusual energy. Every seat was filled with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. News cameras lined the back wall. Council members shuffled papers nervously, aware of the heightened public attention. David stood at the podium, his revised budget proposal displayed on screens throughout the room. Despite having slept barely 2 hours, his voice was clear and steady. "What I'm presenting today isn't just a budget, it's a roadmap for accountability." He clicked to the next slide. "The events of last night, my wrongful detention by Officer Wilson, have been widely reported. But I'm not here to discuss my personal experience. I'm here because what happened to me happens to our citizens every day." Murmurs rippled through the audience. The mayor, seated at the center of the council table, gave an encouraging nod. "This budget allocates $12 million for a fully independent oversight board with real investigative power. It mandates body cameras that cannot be manually deactivated during stops. It funds extensive bias training and psychological evaluations for all officers." Police Chief Rivera shifted uncomfortably in his seat at the side of the chamber. Behind him sat several high-ranking officers and representatives from the police union, their expressions ranging from stone-faced to openly hostile. The current system allowed an officer, with 3 previous excessive force complaints, to remain on patrol without additional training or supervision, David continued. "That ends today." When he finished his presentation, the council opened the floor for public comment. A line quickly formed at the microphone. "My son was stopped 3 times last month driving home from basketball practice," one mother said, her voice breaking. "No violations, no charges. Just because he drives a nice car his grandparents gave him." A retired police lieutenant spoke next. "Not all officers are like Wilson. Many of us serve with honor. These sweeping changes punish everyone for one man's actions." "With respect," David responded, "these changes protect both the public and officers who serve honorably. Good officers have nothing to fear from accountability." After 2 hours of heated testimony, the council called for a vote. The revised budget passed 7-3, a margin that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. As the gavel came down, applause erupted from much of the crowd. David barely had time to process the victory before being whisked into a press conference in the City Hall rotunda. Camera flashes nearly blinded him as he approached the podium, flanked by the mayor and city attorney. The council has taken a historic step today, Mayor Rodriguez announced. Commissioner Patel's leadership has turned a troubling incident into an opportunity for meaningful change. A reporter called out, "What about Officer Wilson? Will he be fired?" The city attorney leaned into the microphone. "Officer Wilson has been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. That investigation will include review of the audio recording of the incident and interviews with all witnesses." "Does the commissioner plan to sue the department?" Another voice shouted. David stepped forward. "My focus isn't on lawsuits. It's on ensuring no other citizen experiences what I did. The reforms approved today will help make that possible." As the press conference concluded, David's phone buzzed with a message from Lisa. The audio recording of his detention had been leaked online and was going viral. Already it had over 1 million views. Across town, Officer Ray Wilson sat in the small conference room of the police union headquarters. Union President Fred Baker paced back and forth, his face flushed with anger. "This is a railroad job," Fred fumed. "They're using you as a scapegoat to push through their agenda." Ray stared at the table. "The recording doesn't sound good." "Context matters," Fred insisted. "You were doing your job in a high-crime area." "Oakwood Heights has the lowest crime rate in the city," Ray interrupted. "We both know that," Fred stopped pacing. "Don't go soft now. We'll fight this all the way. The union has your back." Ray wasn't so sure. His phone had been blowing up all day, some colleagues offering support, others distancing themselves. His sergeant had texted simply, "Should have turned on your body cam." The door opened and a union lawyer entered with a grim expression. "The recording is everywhere. Social media, news sites, radio. They're playing it unedited." Ray winced. He'd finally listened to it that morning, hearing his own voice with new ears. The dismissive tone, the implications about who belonged in which neighborhoods, the escalation over nothing. It all sounded worse than he remembered. "What are my options?" he asked quietly. The lawyer laid out several scenarios, none promising. Best case, suspension without pay for several months. Worst case, termination, possibly with charges for civil rights violations. "What about resignation?" Ray asked. Fred slammed his hand on the table. "Absolutely not. That admits guilt. We fight this tooth and nail." But Ray was beginning to understand something the union president couldn't admit. He had become a liability. Other officers with similar complaints would now face increased scrutiny. The thin blue line was already starting to fracture around him. Back at City Hall, David met with the newly empowered Civilian Oversight Board. Previously a toothless advisory group, they now had funding, staff, and authority to investigate complaints. "We'll start by reviewing all officers with multiple complaints," said Board Chair Dr. Lena Winters. "The data shows 27 officers account for over 60% of excessive force allegations." "Officer Wilson isn't unique," David noted. "He's just the one who got caught on tape." As the meeting progressed, David's phone buzzed with an urgent message. The Police Officers Association had called a press conference for 5 p.m. He excused himself to watch the live stream on his office computer. Union President Baker stood at the microphone, flanked by dozens of uniformed officers. Notably absent was Chief Rivera. "The rush to judgment against Officer Wilson sets a dangerous precedent," Baker declared. "Officers make split-second decisions to keep our communities safe. Monday morning quarterbacking by politicians endangers public safety." The assembled officers nodded in agreement, presenting a united front. But David noticed something telling. Only about 60 officers stood behind Baker. The department had over 500. His assistant knocked on the door. "Chief Rivera is here to see you." The police chief entered alone, looking troubled. "I wasn't informed about the union press conference." "Rents. I noticed your absence," David replied. "Things are dividing quickly within the department," Rivera admitted, taking a seat. "Many officers, especially younger ones and officers of color, don't support what Wilson did. Others see the reforms as an attack on police." "And where do you stand, Chief?" Rivera sighed heavily. "I've been on the force 30 years. Things that were accepted when I started shouldn't be accepted now. But change is hard." "Necessary things often are," David said. "I've reviewed Wilson's full record," Rivera continued. "There's a pattern we should have addressed long ago. And he's not the only one. The conversation was interrupted by breaking news alerts on both their phones. Officer Wilson had just made a public statement, without the union's knowledge or approval. David pulled up the video. Wilson stood alone before a small group of reporters looking tired and subdued. "I made a mistake," Wilson said, his voice rough with emotion. "My actions were wrong. I let biases and assumptions guide my behavior in ways that violated the trust placed in me as an officer. I apologize to Commissioner Patel and to the community I was supposed to serve." The reporters shouted questions, but Wilson continued. "I've submitted my resignation from the police department, effective immediately. No union fight, no excuses. I'll cooperate fully with all investigations into my conduct." David and Chief Rivera watched in stunned silence as Wilson concluded his statement and walked away from the microphones, ignoring the shouted questions behind him. "Did you know he was going to do this?" David asked. Rivera shook his head. "The union will be furious. They wanted to fight this to the end." "Sometimes the people who seem most resistant to change surprise you," David observed. By evening, the story had evolved yet again. Wilson's resignation had split public opinion. Some saw it as an admission of guilt that vindicated the reforms. Others viewed it as an honorable act that should end the matter. Outside the police headquarters, two groups of protesters faced off, one demanding more officers be investigated, the other supporting the police against political attacks. David watched the coverage from his office, where he was putting final touches on implementation plans for the new policies. His phone rang. It was Officer Alvarez from the station. "Sir, I'm calling because a group of us wanted you to know something," Alvarez said. 43 officers have signed a letter supporting the reforms and requesting additional training. We want to be part of the solution. For the first time since the incident began, David felt genuinely hopeful. Not because one officer had resigned or because the budget had passed, but because change was beginning to come from within the department itself. As the sun set over the city, David gathered his things to finally head home. The news cycle would eventually move on, but the structures being put in place today would remain. Officer Wilson's critical mistake had indeed created an opening for change, but sustaining that change would require ongoing commitment from everyone involved. His phone buzzed with a text from Priya. "Dinner's waiting." "City still standing?" David smiled as he typed his response. "Still standing, and maybe, just maybe, getting a little better." 6 months passed, each day building upon the changes set in motion that fateful night. Spring had come to the city, trees budding along the boulevards, new life emerging after the long winter. David stood at the window of his office, watching people cross the plaza below. The view was the same, but almost everything else had changed. On his desk sat the latest quarterly report from the Civilian Oversight Board, a thick document filled with statistics, case reviews, and recommendations. A knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. Ana Cortez, no longer desk sergeant but now Captain Cortez, entered with a tablet in hand. "The final numbers for the first quarter," she said, handing it to him. "Citizen complaints down 34%. Use of force incidents down 27%. Response times unchanged despite predictions they would suffer." David scrolled through the data, a cautious smile forming. "And officer morale?" "Mixed," Ana admitted. "Some veterans still resist the changes, but recruitment applications are up 60%, especially among women and people of color. The younger officers have embraced the new training programs completely." After Officer Wilson's resignation, David had worked closely with Chief Rivera to reshape the department's culture from within. Not through sweeping purges, as some had demanded, but through structural changes, accountability measures, and empowering officers who wanted reform. "How's the body cam program going?" David asked. "Full compliance for 3 straight months," Ana reported. The automatic activation feature removed the "I forgot to turn it on" excuse. Officers grumbled at first, but most now say it protects them from false accusations. David nodded, remembering the battles over that particular reform. The technology had existed for years but had been resisted at every turn. And the community engagement initiatives? Ana's expression brightened. "That's our biggest success. The weekly neighborhood walks have officers knowing residents by name. Local businesses report increased trust. Officer Alvarez's youth basketball program has 400 kids signed up for summer." Not every change had gone smoothly. The police union had fought bitterly against many reforms, especially the new disciplinary procedures. City council meetings had sometimes devolved into shouting matches. A few veteran officers had resigned rather than adapt, but with each passing month the data became harder to argue against. Crime rates remained stable while complaints plummeted. Trust was slowly being rebuilt in neighborhoods where police had long been viewed with suspicion. "There's something else you should see," Anna said, pulling up a video on her tablet. "This happened yesterday in Oakwood Heights." David tensed slightly at the mention of the neighborhood where everything had started. The video showed a police stop, a young black man in a hoodie being approached by two officers. David watched closely, ready to spot problems. Instead, he saw the officers introduce themselves by name, explain why they had approached, a robbery reported nearby, and ask questions respectfully. When the young man provided ID and explained he was waiting for a ride, they thanked him and left without escalation. The entire interaction took less than 3 minutes. Officer Chen and Officer Alvarez, Anna explained. "Both part of our reformed training program." David handed back the tablet. "That's what it should look like." "That's what it's starting to look like more and more," Anna agreed. "Not perfectly, not everywhere, but it's happening." After Anna left, David returned to the window. His phone buzzed with a calendar reminder. The community forum at Westside Community Center was tonight. These monthly sessions had become a cornerstone of rebuilding trust, giving residents direct access to police leadership and city officials. As David gathered his materials, his assistant Lisa entered with an unexpected message. "Former Officer Wilson has requested to meet with you," she said, checking her notes. "He's applied to speak at tonight's community forum." David stared at her in surprise. "Ray Wilson wants to speak at the forum?" "That's what he said. I told him you'd be unavailable before the event, but he's insistent on talking to you first." David checked his watch. He had a small window before his next meeting. "Tell him he has 15 minutes. 30 minutes later, Ray Wilson sat across from David, looking both similar to and different from the officer who had handcuffed him 6 months ago. He wore civilian clothes now, a simple button-down shirt and slacks. He seemed thinner, his posture less rigid. "Thank you for seeing me," Ray began awkwardly. "I wasn't sure you would. Why are you here?" David asked directly. Ray placed a folder on the desk between them. "I've been working with a community outreach program in Eastside, teaching kids about their rights during police interactions, helping them understand how to stay safe while also treating officers with respect." David opened the folder, scanning letters of recommendation from community leaders and program coordinators. "After I resigned," Ray continued, "I had a lot of time to think. At first I was angry, at you, at the department, at the whole situation. I felt like a scapegoat." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Then I listened to that recording again. Really listened. I heard myself the way others heard me. It was humbling." David remained silent, watching the former officer struggle to articulate his journey. "I'm not asking for my job back," Ray clarified, "but I am asking to speak at tonight's forum. To talk about what I've learned. Maybe hearing from someone who was part of the problem might help both sides understand each other better." David leaned back, studying the man before him. "The forum gives voice to community members affected by police actions. Why should you take time that could go to them?" "Because I represent something important, the possibility of change," Ray said simply. "Not just policy change, but personal change. The community needs to know that officers can learn and grow, and officers need to see that acknowledging mistakes doesn't end your life." It was a compelling argument. David had seen how both sides had become entrenched. Community members believing officers could never change, and officers feeling that any admission of wrongdoing would destroy them. 5 minutes, David decided. After the community speakers. Ray nodded gratefully. "Thank you." That evening, the community center hummed with energy. Over 200 people filled the chairs, with more standing along the walls. The first hour followed the usual format: police representatives sharing updates on reforms, community members raising concerns and asking questions. Then David introduced the final speaker. "Many of you will recognize Ray Wilson," he said simply. "He's here to share his perspective." A murmur ran through the crowd as Ray approached the microphone. Some faces showed anger, others curiosity. Ray looked nervous but determined as he unfolded a single sheet of paper. 6 months ago, I made a terrible mistake," he began. I detained Commissioner Patel because of assumptions I made based on his appearance. I let biases I didn't even recognize guide my actions. The room fell silent. I'm not here to excuse what I did, Ray continued. I'm here because my story didn't end with my resignation. It's been a difficult journey of self-reflection. I've had to confront uncomfortable truths about myself and the system I was part of. He described his work with youth programs, the hostility he initially faced, and the slow process of earning trust. He talked about learning to listen rather than assume. His words weren't polished, but they were sincere. Change is possible, he concluded, for individuals and for systems. I know because I'm living it. And while I can't undo my actions that night, I can dedicate myself to making sure fewer officers make the same mistakes. When he finished, the response was mixed. Some applause, some crossed arms, many thoughtful expressions. But something important had happened in that room. A conversation had begun that transcended the usual battle lines. After the forum ended, David found himself surrounded by community members with questions and feedback. From across the room, he saw Ray engaged in intense conversation with a group that included several young people from his program. Officer Alvarez approached David with a look of cautious optimism. That was unexpected, he said, nodding toward Ray. Do you think he meant it? I think he's trying, David replied. Just like the department is trying. Just like we're all trying. As the crowd thinned, David stepped outside into the spring evening. The community center stood at the border between Oakwood Heights and the less affluent East Side, a physical representation of the divides the city was working to bridge. Captain Cortez joined him on the steps. Good turnout tonight, David nodded. Better than last month. The work continues, she said, echoing the phrase that had become something of a mantra among reform advocates. It does, David agreed. But for the first time, I feel like we're moving forward rather than just talking about it. In the parking lot, he watched as Ray Wilson helped an elderly community activist to her car, the two deep in conversation despite their obvious differences. It was a small moment, unremarkable to most observers, but to David it represented something profound. The incident 6 months ago had been a catalyst, a painful but necessary awakening. The officer's critical mistake had indeed created an opening for change. But sustaining that change, building something better from the broken pieces of the old system, that was the real work. And it was happening, day by day, conversation by conversation, policy by policy. David thought back to that night in his car, the flash of a police light on his window, the sound of handcuffs closing around his wrists. He couldn't have imagined then where it would lead, not just to punishment for one officer, but to the beginning of genuine transformation. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the community center steps. There would be more challenges tomorrow, more resistance to overcome, more progress to fight for. But tonight, in this moment, David allowed himself to feel something that had been in short supply these past months. Hope.